Hey guys, tonight we begin with the towering stone arena where gladiators fought and history textbooks confidently tell you it was all built for entertainment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you are standing in Rome after what can only be described as the year everyone lost their minds. You wake up one morning and there is an emperor. A few months later, there is a different emperor, then another, then another. 4 emperors in 1 year. At this point, you are not even learning their names. You are just waiting to see which one survives the season. You are not in the Senate. You are not commanding legions. You are simply trying to buy bread without accidentally pledging loyalty to the wrong man. Every coin you receive might already be outdated. The face stamped on it could belong to someone who is currently very dead. Political stability feels like a rumor started by optimists. Soldiers march through the streets regularly, and you never quite know if they are defending Rome or preparing to switch sides again. Loyalty changes faster than weather. One day people cheer, the next day they pretend they never cheered at all. You have learned something important this year. Survival in Rome requires flexible opinions. Then Vespasian rises. He is not glamorous, not dramatic, not Nero playing the lyre while the city burns. Vespasian feels sturdy, practical, like a man who would rather count supplies than host poetry nights. And that, frankly, is comforting. You are tired. Exhausted, actually. Tired of civil war. Tired of wondering which general will decide he deserves the throne more than the current occupant. Tired of watching emperors last about as long as fresh bread in a crowded market. So when Vespasian announces a massive public construction project, you listen. Because big construction means something important. Permanence. Stone does not panic. Stone does not stage coups. And here is where the genius appears. The location he chooses is not random. It is the former site of Nero's private lake, part of that absurd golden palace Nero built for himself. A personal playground in the middle of your city. You watched Nero take space for himself. Now you watch Vespasian give space back. The lake is filled in. The emperor's private luxury disappears under dirt and labour, and rising from it will be an amphitheatre for the people. You are meant to see this and think, this emperor restores what was stolen. You are meant to feel included. After a year of chaos, you do not crave entertainment. You crave reassurance. And the Colosseum begins not as a place of games, but as a very large, very expensive way of saying, relax. I am in control now. And honestly, after 4 emperors in 1 year, that almost sounds romantic. So now you stand there watching the former lake of Nero disappear beneath layers of soil and sweat. You remember that lake. You remember how it shimmered in the middle of the city like an insult. Nero had taken a massive portion of Rome and turned it into his private fantasy complex. The Domus Aurea, golden halls, artificial landscapes. A lake where there absolutely did not need to be a lake. It was less public service and more, I deserve my own planet, and you paid for it. Indirectly, of course. You always do. Now Vespasian fills it in. Not quietly, not subtly, publicly. You watch workers swarm the area. Stone blocks arrive. Foundations are dug. The message is impossible to miss. Where Nero built for himself, Vespasian builds for you. And here is where you start to feel something dangerous. Gratitude. Because after chaos and ego and civil war, this feels generous. This feels stable. This feels like someone trying to win you over instead of ruling you by theatrical meltdown. But let's be honest. This is not charity. This is strategy. The structure rising from the earth is not just an amphitheatre. It is a declaration carved in stone. Every column says, the emperor gives back. Every arch whispers, I am not Nero. Every massive stone block silently insists, Rome is stable again. You are meant to look at it and feel included in something bigger. And it works. Because large buildings have a psychological effect. They make instability feel smaller. They make you feel like someone powerful is in charge of logistics. And if someone can coordinate tens of thousands of workers and unimaginable amounts of stone, surely they can handle political chaos too. Right? The genius is this. The Colosseum is being built not in some distant district, but in the heart of the city. You walk past it. You see it growing. You hear the hammering. You smell the dust. It becomes part of your daily life before a single gladiator ever steps inside. By the time it is finished, you do not see it as a gift. You see it as proof. Proof that Rome is functioning. Proof that Vespasian is legitimate. Proof that the nightmare year is over. And that is the real purpose. Before the first game is even announced, the Colosseum has already done its job. It has replaced memory. Where Nero once reflected on water, Vespasian now reflects power, and you are standing there, slowly believing it. Now the structure is nearly complete, and word spreads quickly. Games are coming. Not small games, not neighborhood wrestling matches. Spectacle, grand openings, public celebrations. And you feel it, that shift in the city's mood. Because Rome has a phrase you know well, bread and circuses. Give people food, give them entertainment, keep them satisfied, keep them loyal, keep them too busy cheering to start asking complicated political questions. You understand hunger. You have stood in line for grain. You have felt prices rise. You have watched unrest simmer when supplies run thin. But when free distributions are announced alongside public games, something changes. Tension eases. Conversations soften. Even the grumpiest citizens suddenly develop very strong opinions about seating arrangements instead of imperial legitimacy. You tell yourself it is harmless. After all, who does not enjoy a day off work? The opening games last for days, then weeks. The emperor spares no expense. Exotic animals, elaborate hunts, gladiators from distant lands, execution spectacles carefully staged to feel both thrilling and morally justified. You sit in the crowd, surrounded by thousands. You cheer, you flinch, you feel alive. And here is the part you do not immediately notice. While you are watching the arena is shaping you. Because every event reinforces a narrative. Rome is powerful. Rome is victorious. Rome conquers lands so far away that even the animals look foreign. And at the center of it all sits the emperor, calm, composed, presiding over the chaos as if he personally controls fate. You are meant to associate stability with spectacle. When the crowd roars, it feels unified. For a few hours, you are not divided by class or neighborhood or politics. You are Roman. Together, loud, overwhelmed. And that unity is intoxicating. You leave the Colosseum exhausted but satisfied. You talk about the fights, you replay the dramatic moments, you argue about which gladiator showed the most courage. You are not discussing tax reforms. You are not discussing succession crises. You are not discussing how quickly Rome nearly collapsed just months ago. The brilliance of bread and circuses is not that it entertains you. It is that it redirects you. And the Colosseum, this towering, magnificent stone giant, is the most powerful redirecting device Rome has ever built. You feel grateful for the games. And that gratitude is exactly the point. You arrive early on game day, not because you are particularly invested in the fate of a Thracian gladiator named something dramatic, but because seating matters. Very much. The Colosseum may feel like a public space, but it is one of the most carefully organized social diagrams ever constructed in stone. As you climb the steps, you begin to notice it. The lower levels, closest to the arena, are not for you. They are for senators, magistrates, and elite citizens whose sandals probably cost more than your annual grain allowance. They sit comfortably, shaded, near the emperor. close enough to see the expressions on a gladiator's face, close enough to be seen. Above them sit the equestrians, then respectable male citizens, then further up, ordinary Roman men like you. Higher still, women, the poor, the people who technically count but not quite as much. The architecture itself whispers your place in society. You are not told you are lower in status. You feel it. As you climb higher, the seats narrow, the stairs steepen, the shade becomes less reliable, the sun feels personal. You glance down at the senators below, draped in white, relaxed, almost bored. They are part of the spectacle too. Their position signals importance without a single speech being made. And suddenly you understand something unsettling. The Colosseum is not just organizing the crowd, it is rehearsing hierarchy. Even during entertainment, Rome reminds you who is above you and who is below you. And here is the clever part. You accept it. You do not protest your seating level. You do not demand relocation. The order feels natural because it is structured so elegantly. Stone makes inequality feel permanent, rational, almost logical. You look down at the arena floor, then back at the emperor's elevated box. He sees everything. You see him seeing everything. And thousands of others are seeing him too. The design ensures that no matter where you sit, you remain aware of two things: the spectacle below and the power above. The games begin. The crowd erupts. And in that roar, hierarchy is reinforced without a single decree being announced. You are entertained, yes, but you are also positioned, placed, organized. The Colosseum does not just show you violence. It quietly reminds you where you stand in Rome's grand design. And you sit there, cheering, fully aware of your seat. Because in Rome, even fun has structure. As the crowd settles and the games begin, you realize something subtle but powerful. You are not just watching gladiators. You are watching the emperor. He enters deliberately, not rushed, not casual. Every movement calculated. He takes his place in the imperial box, elevated just enough to dominate the view without appearing desperate for attention. You cannot ignore him, even if you try. The design ensures it. The seating curves toward him. The lines of sight frame him. The architecture almost bows in his direction. No matter where you sit, your eyes drift back to that central figure. The gladiators salute him. The announcers invoke his name. The crowd chants in rhythm. And suddenly you understand something uncomfortable. The emperor is the real main character. The fights? Secondary? The animals? Accessories? The blood? Stage lighting. The entire arena is a machine built to amplify his presence. When a gladiator wins, the crowd looks to him. When a defeated fighter kneels, everyone watches for his gesture. Life or death is dramatized as a single movement of his hand. You lean forward, waiting. The crowd roars approval or mercy, but the final decision rests above you. You are allowed to cheer. You are allowed to express emotion. You are not allowed to decide. It feels participatory. It is not. The brilliance lies in the illusion. You feel involved, empowered, part of the spectacle. But ultimate control never leaves the emperor's fingers. And that is the point. After civil war and instability, you crave certainty. You want someone who looks calm while thousands scream. Someone who appears steady while chaos unfolds in the sand below. The Colosseum gives you that image. A ruler seated above violence, orchestrating it. Controlled, confident, unshaken. Even the timing of the games reinforces this. Victories are dedicated to him. Celebrations revolve around him. Public generosity flows through him. You leave the arena thinking about the spectacular fight. But what lingers in your mind is the image of the emperor. Elevated, decisive, untouchable. The Colosseum does not merely entertain you. It trains you to associate authority with spectacle. It teaches you that power belongs at the center, slightly above eye level, framed by stone and adoration. And as you cheer, you are not just enjoying yourself. You are rehearsing loyalty. You tell yourself you are here for entertainment. But as the games unfold, something else becomes clear. This is not just spectacle. It is instruction. When criminals are brought into the arena, they are not simply executed. They are staged. Their deaths are choreographed, sometimes dressed as mythological figures, sometimes forced into elaborate reenactments where the ending is never in doubt. You watch. You feel uncomfortable. You cheer anyway. Because everyone else is cheering, and because somewhere in your mind, a small voice reminds you that you are not the one in the sand. The message does not need to be spoken aloud. Step out of line, and this is where you end up. The arena is a classroom. The lesson is obedience. When prisoners from conquered territories are paraded before the crowd, the symbolism sharpens. You see men who once fought against Rome, now kneeling in Roman sand. You see exotic animals dragged from distant provinces, displayed and slaughtered for applause. The message is clear. Rome conquers everything: people, beasts, entire landscapes. And if Rome can control lions and warriors, it can certainly control you. You feel pride swell in your chest. You are part of something unstoppable. The empire stretches beyond the horizon. Its enemies become entertainment. Its victories become festivals. But beneath that pride lies something colder: fear. Because the same machinery that humiliates Rome's enemies could humiliate you. The same crowd that cheers executions could cheer yours. The Colosseum does not only display Rome's dominance over outsiders, it quietly reminds insiders that dominance applies to them too. And here is the brilliance. You feel safe, because you are seated, because you are cheering, because you are not in chains. The spectacle creates distance between you and the victims. You convince yourself that those in the arena deserve their fate. Criminals, rebels, enemies, people who made bad decisions. Not you. Never you. But the building does not care who you are. It is designed to transform punishment into public reassurance. Rome is strong. Rome is merciless. Rome is orderly, and order requires consequences. You walk away from the games both thrilled and steadied. The violence unsettled you, but it also comforted you. Because in a chaotic world, controlled brutality feels like stability. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. At some point during the games, you begin to feel powerful. The gladiator falls to his knees. The crowd erupts. Arms wave. Voices rise. Some shout for mercy. Others demand blood. The sound becomes a living thing, a roaring storm of opinion. And for a moment, you believe you matter. You believe your voice matters. Because the emperor looks toward the crowd. He pauses. He considers. You shout louder. You feel the surge of thousands around you, united in decision. This is your moment. Except, it is not. The final gesture always belongs to him. The emperor may appear to weigh the crowd's desire, but he does not depend on it. He uses it. The pause is theatrical. The suspense is deliberate. It creates tension, then release. You feel involved in the outcome, but the outcome was never truly yours. The brilliance of the Colosseum is that it allows you to taste influence without ever granting it. You can cheer, you can protest, you can express outrage, but you cannot overrule. And yet you walk away believing you participated in justice. It feels democratic. It is not. This illusion spreads beyond the arena. If you feel heard here, you are less likely to demand real power elsewhere. If you feel your voice can decide a gladiator's fate, you are less inclined to question who decides Rome's future. The arena gives you symbolic authority while preserving actual hierarchy, and the design reinforces it. You sit with thousands, shoulder to shoulder, roaring together. It feels like collective strength, but notice how that strength is contained, controlled, directed toward the sand below, never upward. The emperor is never the object of the crowd's decision. Only the performers are. And here lies the genius. The Colosseum lets you rehearse power without ever threatening power. You experience adrenaline, influence, and moral judgment, all within safe boundaries. You feel part of Rome's machinery, but you are never steering it. As you leave the arena, you talk about how we spared that gladiator, how we demanded mercy, how we showed strength. You use the word we, but the empire runs on one word only: him, and the Colosseum ensures you never quite notice the difference. You look up, and for a moment, you forget everything else. The sheer size of the Colosseum overwhelms you. Stone arches stacked upon stone arches, columns rising in perfect symmetry, corridors that seem to stretch endlessly. It is not merely large, it is excessive in the most deliberate way possible. You have seen buildings before. This is something else. You enter through one of the numbered arches. The flow of people moves with surprising efficiency. Thousands of citizens filtering in without chaos. No bottlenecks, no confusion. It almost feels organized. And that alone feels revolutionary. Because Rome, after its recent instability, has not exactly been a symbol of calm coordination. But this building works. Underneath the arena floor lies a network of corridors, cages, pulleys, and lifts. Animals rise from below as if summoned from the underworld. Gladiators appear through trapdoors. Entire scenes transform in moments. You do not see the mechanics. You only see the magic. And that is the point. Rome wants you to feel awe, because awe softens doubt. If an empire can engineer something this complex, something that controls beasts, crowds, and spectacle with such precision, surely it can govern a continent. Surely it can manage politics. Surely it deserves loyalty. You sit there, heart racing as lions emerge seemingly from nowhere, as elaborate sets rise from beneath the sand. The crowd gasps in unison. You do not think about taxation. You do not think about succession crises. You think, how did they build this? And beneath that question lies something more important. Who built this? The answer, of course, is Rome. But Rome now has a face. The emperor funded it. The emperor inaugurated it. The emperor presides over it. The building becomes proof of competence. Stone as propaganda. Engineering as reassurance. Even the retractable awning overhead, shielding you from the sun, feels like a subtle kindness. A reminder that the state protects you, that the empire covers you. Literally, you are not just entertained, you are impressed. And impressed citizens are easier to govern, because when you stand inside something so vast, so ordered, so undeniably powerful, you feel small in the best possible way. Small and protected. And that feeling is worth more than any gladiator's performance. You wake up thinking about the games, not about grain shortages, not about border skirmishes, not about rumours in the Senate. The games. That is not an accident. Rome is large, complex, messy. There are debts, political rivalries, governors skimming wealth in distant provinces, soldiers loyal to generals more than to the state. The empire is stable on the surface, but underneath the machinery grinds loudly. You do not hear that grinding, because lions are roaring. When the Colosseum announces a new series of games, the city changes. Conversations shift instantly. Markets buzz with predictions about gladiators. Children reenact fights in alleyways. Adults argue about which combat style is superior, as if it personally affects tax policy. You participate eagerly, because spectacle is easier than uncertainty. When you sit in the arena, surrounded by tens of thousands of voices, the problems of empire shrink. Your personal worries shrink. Even the memory of civil war fades slightly under the thunder of applause. You feel unified, distracted, absorbed. And distraction is powerful, because while you are focused downward, toward the sand, you are not looking upward toward governance. While you debate whether a gladiator deserved mercy, you are not debating the emperor's decisions. The Colosseum occupies your emotional energy. It fills your thoughts. It gives you stories to retell. It gives you something dramatic and immediate instead of something structural and distant. And here is the genius. It does not feel forced. No one commands you to care about the games. You want to care. After all, who prefers worrying about inflation in Gaul when you could be watching a net fighter dodge a sword? The arena transforms anxiety into adrenaline. It channels fear into excitement. It turns political tension into theatrical tension. And you leave exhausted but satisfied, because Rome feels active, alive, in control. Even if that control is mostly happening inside a ring of stone. The Colosseum does not solve Rome's deeper problems. It manages your perception of them. And perception, as you are slowly learning, is more important than policy. When the crowd roars, you forget instability. When the spectacle dazzles, you forget fragility. And that is not entertainment. That is management. You tell yourself you enjoy the games because they are exciting. And they are. Your pulse quickens when the gates open. Your body leans forward when steel clashes. You feel genuine suspense as combatants circle each other. It is dramatic, unpredictable, alive. But beneath the excitement lies something colder. You are watching death. And not in some distant abstract way, not in the controlled detachment of battlefield rumours. This is deliberate, public, framed. The executions are not accidents of war, they are performances. When condemned prisoners enter the arena, they are sometimes dressed in costumes. Mythological narratives are reenacted. A criminal becomes Icarus. A rebel becomes Orpheus. The story always ends badly. You watch. You laugh nervously. You cheer when the crowd demands it, because the entire environment pressures you to respond correctly. The atmosphere does not allow silence. And yet, somewhere inside, you feel the weight of it, because every punishment is a reminder. Rome does not tolerate disorder. Rome does not forget rebellion. Rome does not hesitate. The crowd's roar becomes a strange blend of fear and relief. Relief that the violence is directed outward. Fear that it could one day turn inward. You glance at the Emperor's box again. He remains composed. The chaos below does not disturb him. That steadiness is part of the message. He governs life and death with a gesture. You cheer. Because cheering aligns you with power. Silence would feel suspicious. The Colosseum teaches you something subtle. Brutality can feel stabilizing when it is controlled, when it is framed as justice, when it is organized with precision. Random violence is terrifying. Structured violence feels like order, and Rome is obsessed with order. As the sand absorbs blood, the crowd absorbs reassurance. The empire is strong. The empire punishes. The empire protects. All three ideas blend together in the heat of the arena. You leave with adrenaline still in your veins. You replay the dramatic moments in your mind. But beneath the excitement lingers something else. A quiet understanding that the Colosseum is not merely thrilling. It is instructive. It shows you exactly what happens when someone steps outside Rome's rules. And it does so with applause. That combination, fear wrapped in fascination, is far more powerful than entertainment alone. You admire the Colosseum's stone, the arches, the marble, the scale. But you rarely ask where it all came from, and that is convenient, because the answer is not romantic. The Colosseum was funded largely by war. When Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in Judea, vast amounts of wealth were seized. Gold, silver, sacred objects, entire treasuries emptied and redirected back to Rome. Prisoners were marched across continents, and that wealth did not disappear. It turned into stone, into arches, into spectacle. When you sit inside the Colosseum, you are seated inside the spoils of conquest. The very building around you is a victory monument, not just to engineering, but to domination. You cheer gladiators beneath walls financed by distant suffering. And here is the unsettling brilliance. The empire converts violence abroad into stability at home. Foreign defeat becomes domestic reassurance. You feel proud of Rome's strength. You feel protected by its expansion. You rarely pause to consider the cost paid elsewhere, because the Colosseum frames conquest as celebration. Prisoners captured in war sometimes fight in the arena. Animals dragged from Africa or the Near East are slaughtered for spectacle. Entire cultures are reduced to costumes and stage props. The message is simple. Rome consumes the world and then displays it. You might even think of the Colosseum as a museum of power, except instead of quiet halls and labelled artifacts, it roars and bleeds. The building whispers a constant reminder. This empire wins. And when an empire wins, it builds. You do not see the forced labour. You do not see the caravans of seized treasure. You see marble polished smooth and arches perfectly aligned. The discomfort of conquest is transformed into entertainment. You clap for it. You feel pride in it. Because if Rome is powerful enough to dominate distant lands, surely it is powerful enough to protect you. That connection forms automatically in your mind. War funds architecture. Architecture funds loyalty. Loyalty funds stability. The Colosseum is not merely a stage. It is a trophy large enough to hold 50,000 witnesses, and you are one of them, sitting inside the physical proof that Rome's expansion is not just military, it is monumental. You look around during the games and notice something remarkable. For a few hours, Rome feels united. Senators sit below, merchants sit above them, artisans, labourers, soldiers, freedmen, even visitors from distant provinces, all gathered in one structure. Different accents, different incomes, different frustrations. And yet, when the gates open and the crowd erupts, those differences blur. You shout at the same moment as thousands of others. You gasp together. You lean forward in unison. It feels powerful. For a brief time, you are not divided by class or politics. You are Roman. That identity overshadows everything else, and that sensation is intoxicating. The Colosseum creates collective emotion at scale. It synchronizes your reactions. When tens of thousands cheer simultaneously, you feel part of something vast and unstoppable. That feeling lingers, because unity is stabilizing. After civil war and instability, nothing is more comforting than shared reaction, shared outrage, shared excitement. But look closer. The unity is carefully contained. You are united in cheering, united in spectacle, united in observing. You are not united in decision-making. You are not united in power. The hierarchy remains physically intact. Senators are still closer to the sand. The emperor still sits elevated. The structure of society does not dissolve. It simply becomes less noticeable under the noise. The Colosseum allows Rome to experience emotional equality without threatening structural inequality. Everyone can roar, few can rule, and yet the shared experience is enough. When you leave the arena, you feel connected to your fellow citizens. You speak the same language of spectacle. You reference the same dramatic moments. You share stories about that one gladiator who fought bravely against impossible odds. Those shared stories create cohesion, and cohesion reduces unrest. It is difficult to rebel against a system you just cheered inside. The Colosseum does not erase Rome's divisions. It overlays them with a layer of collective identity. You leave thinking, we are powerful, not I am powerless. That subtle shift in perspective is critical. Because unity, even temporary unity, strengthens regimes, and the Colosseum manufactures it with astonishing efficiency. It is not just a building. It is a synchronization device. And you, along with 50,000 others, are perfectly in rhythm. Imagine years have passed. You have attended countless games. You have watched victories, defeats, executions, celebrations. The Colosseum has become familiar, almost routine, a place you associate with noise, heat, adrenaline. But empires do not remain unchanged forever. Gradually, the frequency of games shifts. Political priorities evolve. Economic pressures tighten. Military threats demand attention elsewhere. The roaring grows less frequent. The great machinery beneath the arena slows. And one day, you notice something strange. The spectacle feels smaller. The building is still enormous. The stone still stands. But the emotional intensity that once filled it begins to fade. Because spectacle is powerful, but it is not eternal. As Rome changes, so does the purpose of its spaces. The Colosseum, once the beating heart of public drama, begins to age. Maintenance becomes harder. Funding becomes more complicated. The empire's focus stretches thinner. You walk past it now, not always entering. You remember the thunder of the crowd, the synchronized chants, the emperor's raised hand. But the present feels quieter, and this is where the truth reveals itself. The Colosseum was never about entertainment alone. Entertainment can fade. It can decline. It can be replaced by new forms of distraction. What endures is the symbol. Even as the games slow, the structure remains a reminder of what Rome once projected. Control, dominance, coordination, grandeur. It becomes a monument to memory, a relic of psychological architecture. You look at it differently now. When it was full, it felt alive. When it empties, it feels heavy. Because without constant spectacle, you begin to see the building more clearly. You see how it framed power, how it positioned you, how it directed your attention downward while elevating authority upward. And perhaps, quietly, you start asking questions you did not ask before. Questions about the cost, questions about the purpose, questions about whether spectacle was ever the real point. The roaring may fade, but the message carved into stone remains. The Colosseum outlives the games because it was never just a venue. It was an idea. And ideas are harder to dismantle than arenas. Now imagine you are standing in front of the Colosseum centuries later. The games are gone. The emperors are dust. The crowd no longer roars. Tourists circle the structure. Guides explain gladiator fights. Cameras flash. People call it an ancient stadium. And you realize something strange. We still describe it as entertainment. We reduce it to spectacle. We frame it as the Roman equivalent of a sports arena. But that interpretation feels incomplete. Because if it were merely entertainment, it would not have required this scale. It would not have needed such precise hierarchy. It would not have been built on the erased remains of Nero's private lake. It would not have been so carefully tied to imperial legitimacy. Entertainment does not usually require that much political choreography. Standing here, you can almost feel how modern narratives simplify it. We say, Romans loved games. We say, gladiators were celebrities. We say, the Colosseum was built for fun. And technically, yes. But that explanation feels comfortable. Too comfortable. Because it allows us to separate ourselves from it. We can laugh at ancient brutality, shake our heads at their bloodlust, treat it as a strange quirk of a distant civilization. What we avoid acknowledging is how effective the system was. The Colosseum managed perception. It redirected attention. It reinforced hierarchy. It created unity without distributing power. That is not an ancient problem. That is a timeless strategy. When you look at it honestly, the Colosseum feels less like a relic and more like a blueprint. A blueprint for how spectacle can stabilize fragile authority, how architecture can frame power, how distraction can soften dissent. And suddenly, the building feels less distant, less ancient, because the formula still exists. Different materials, different arenas, different forms of spectacle. But the structure of influence remains familiar. The Colosseum was not a mistake of a primitive age. It was a masterclass. And perhaps the reason we still call it entertainment is because admitting its true purpose feels uncomfortably relevant. When Norse ships cut through the cold Atlantic and reached the wooded shores of Vinland, the sailors expected timber, grapes, and opportunity. What they did not expect were people. Yet in the pages of the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, we find the first written descriptions of indigenous North Americans encountered by Europeans. The Norse called them scralings. It was not a neutral label. The word likely implied something like outsiders, strangers, perhaps even barbarians. But that name tells us more about Norse assumptions than about the people themselves. From the Viking point of view, they were the explorers, the settlers, the bearers of iron and longships. Anyone else, by definition, was the other. The sagas describe these first meetings as cautious, almost tense from the start. Norse settlers saw groups of indigenous people observing them from a distance. No grand speeches, no formal treaties, just two worlds studying one another across a narrow strip of shoreline. Imagine the silence, the wind in the grass, unfamiliar faces, weapons visible on both sides. At first, trade followed. The sagas mention red cloth exchanged for furs. The Norse brought iron tools and woven fabric. The indigenous groups offered animal skins and local goods. It was practical, simple, almost hopeful. For a moment, cooperation seemed possible. But beneath the surface was uncertainty. The Norse were few in number, far from home, dependent on fragile supply lines back to Greenland. The indigenous communities, by contrast, knew the land intimately. They understood its seasons, its resources, its dangers. They had numbers. They had mobility. And they had no reason to welcome permanent foreign settlements. The sagas portray the scralings as unpredictable and easily angered. Yet the Norse themselves arrived armed, claiming territory, building structures. From another perspective, it was the Vikings who appeared strange and threatening. Bearded men with axes, metal blades, and ambitions of settlement. This first contact was not a heroic handshake across civilizations. It was a fragile standoff wrapped in curiosity. Two cultures met without shared language, shared gods, or shared expectations. For a brief moment, trade bridged the gap, but tension lingered just beneath the surface. And that tension would not stay quiet for long. That tension did not explode immediately. Instead, it lingered. Awkward, cautious, almost polite. After the first sightings and wary glances, something surprisingly practical happened. Trade. According to the sagas, the Norse settlers offered red woolen cloth, milk products, and metal tools. In return, indigenous groups brought furs, thick, valuable pelts that were worth far more in Greenland and Iceland than any grapes Vinland might offer. It was not a romantic exchange of cultures, it was business. And business, at least at first, kept the peace. Picture the scene. Norse traders stand near their wooden encampment, likely at what we now identify as Lance aux Meadows. Indigenous families approach carefully, perhaps in skin boats along the coast. No shared language, no written contracts, just gestures, objects held up, slow movements. The sagas note that the indigenous traders particularly desired red cloth. That detail matters. Red dye in medieval Europe was expensive and visually striking. To the Norse, it may have seemed ordinary merchandise. To the people of the region, it may have been something new, vibrant, and symbolically powerful. Trade often thrives on novelty, but even peaceful exchange carries risk. The Norse settlers were few, perhaps only a few dozen at most. Every interaction exposed their vulnerability. They had women and children with them, livestock, limited defences. If a disagreement erupted, they could not rely on reinforcements arriving quickly from Greenland. The sagas also describe strict trading rules. The Norse reportedly forbade the sale of weapons to the indigenous groups. That alone reveals anxiety. They understood that iron blades and axes would dramatically shift the balance of power. Trust has limits, especially when you are vastly outnumbered in unfamiliar territory. And then there is the matter of misunderstanding. What one side considered a fair trade might have seemed insulting to the other. What one gesture meant as friendliness might have appeared threatening. Cultural gaps are not small inconveniences, they are fault lines. For a brief period, the system worked. Goods exchanged hands. No large-scale violence erupted, It must have seemed, to the Norse at least, that Vinland could sustain both settlement and trade, but this balance was delicate, impossibly delicate. Trade can create connection, yes, but it can also amplify suspicion. Every meeting required courage from both sides, and eventually, one small spark would be enough to turn commerce into conflict. Trade can survive suspicion, it cannot survive fear. The sagas make it clear that whatever fragile balance existed between the Norse settlers and the people they called Skrælings did not last. The shift from exchange to hostility was not dramatic at first. It was subtle, a misunderstanding, a sudden movement, a raised weapon, and then everything changed. In one account from the saga of the Greenlanders, the tension begins with something almost absurdly small: a bull. The Norse had brought livestock with them to Vinland, cows and bulls, symbols of settlement and permanence. One day, a bull reportedly burst from the woods, bellowing loudly. The indigenous visitors, unfamiliar with this animal, were startled and retreated in alarm. To the Norse, a bull was farm life. To the indigenous observers, it may have looked like a charging beast. That single moment captures the core problem of this encounter. Neither side understood the other's world. After that scare, relations deteriorated quickly. The sagas describe the indigenous groups returning in greater numbers, armed and organized. What had once been cautious trade gatherings now resembled something else entirely: preparation. The Norse settlers, few in number and aware of their isolation, fortified themselves. Shields were raised, weapons were kept close, defensive lines were drawn around their camp. This was no longer commerce, this was survival. Then came open conflict. The sagas tell of projectile weapons, likely slings or arrows, used by the indigenous fighters. The Norse responded with swords and axes, steel against wood and bone, two different military traditions colliding in a narrow clearing by the sea. What stands out is not the scale of the battle, it was likely small, but the imbalance. The Norse were vastly outnumbered. Even if their iron weapons were superior in close combat, numbers matter. Terrain matters. Local knowledge matters even more. The sagas frame the Norse as brave but vulnerable, facing waves of attackers. But from another perspective, indigenous groups may have seen this as resistance against encroachment. Foreigners had arrived. They built structures. They claimed land. Conflict was not irrational. It was strategic. Whatever the exact trigger, that first spark of violence burned away any illusion of coexistence. Trade had ended. Now the question was no longer how to profit from Vinland. It was whether the Norse could survive there at all. Once violence began, the illusion of control vanished. The Norse had crossed an ocean believing they were masters of expansion. After all, they had settled Iceland. They had colonized Greenland. They had raided and traded across Europe. But Vinland was not another sparsely inhabited island. It was a land already lived in, understood and defended, and the numbers were not in their favour. The sagas suggest that the Norse presence in Vinland was small, perhaps only 60 to 100 settlers at most, including women and children. That is not an army. That is a vulnerable outpost. Meanwhile, the indigenous communities of the region could mobilize far greater numbers. Even a few hundred defenders would have overwhelmed the settlement easily. At what we now identify as Lance aux Meadows, the Norse built sod structures, workshops, and living quarters. Archaeology confirms they were skilled builders. But buildings do not equal security. Wooden walls cannot stop a determined force that knows the land better than you ever will. The Norse advantage was iron. Swords, axes, nails, rivets. These were technological edges. But iron alone does not guarantee victory. Supply lines mattered. Replacement weapons mattered. And the Norse were cut off. Any serious loss could not easily be replenished from Greenland, let alone Norway. Meanwhile, indigenous fighters likely relied on mobility. They knew the forests, the rivers, the seasonal movements of animals. They could strike and withdraw. They could observe without being seen. The Norse, by contrast, were fixed in place. Settlers do not move quickly. The sagas portray the settlers as courageous and disciplined, forming shield walls and defending their camp. Yet courage does not multiply manpower, and discipline does not change geography. The Norse were operating at the very edge of their world, far from reinforcements, far from familiarity. Psychology plays a role here too. Every sighting in the tree line would have felt like a threat. Every snapped branch at night could signal attack. Living in constant alertness drains morale. Fear accumulates. This was no longer about trade or curiosity. It was about whether a tiny colony could survive sustained pressure from a population that did not want them there. The answer was becoming clearer with every confrontation. Vinland was rich. It was promising, but it was not empty. And that changed everything. When we talk about Norse expansion, we often picture bearded warriors and clashing steel. But Vinland was not only men with axes, women and children were there too. And that changes the story. One of the most important figures in this fragile settlement was Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir. According to the sagas, she travelled to Vinland and gave birth there. Her son, Snorri, is often described as one of the first Europeans born in North America. That detail feels symbolic, almost triumphant. A new generation in a new world. But imagine the reality behind that symbolism. Gudrid was living in a contested land, surrounded by uncertainty, in a settlement constantly under threat. This was not a peaceful farming colony. It was a frontier outpost balancing on the edge of violence. Raising a child in that environment meant living with constant fear. The sagas recount one moment that captures this tension vividly. During a confrontation, Indigenous fighters advanced toward the Norse camp. Panic spread among the settlers. In one version of the story, a woman named Freydis, often identified as the daughter of Eric the Red, reportedly stepped forward when others hesitated. She is said to have bared her breast and struck it with a sword, shouting defiantly at the attackers. Whether the scene happened exactly as described is impossible to confirm. The sagas were written centuries later and are layered with drama, but the detail matters symbolically. It shows that the Norse presence in Vinland had reached a breaking point. Women were no longer sheltered from danger. They were directly confronting it. This was not glory. It was desperation. Children, livestock supplies, everything the settlers brought with them now felt like a liability. Every skirmish threatened not just pride or territory, but families. And families change strategic calculations. A warrior might risk death. A parent weighs survival differently. The indigenous communities, meanwhile, were defending their homeland. From their perspective, the Norse were not heroic explorers. They were intruders building permanent structures. The presence of Norse families did not soften that reality. If anything, it signalled long-term settlement. And that was the real turning point. Vinland was no longer a temporary trading station. It was becoming something more permanent. And permanence in contested land rarely ends quietly. The question was no longer whether the Norse could fight. It was whether staying was worth the cost. At some point, the fighting stops being about pride. It becomes about math. The Norse settlers in Vinland had courage. They had iron. They had ships. But they did not have numbers. And slowly, painfully, that reality began to sink in. The sagas describe repeated clashes. Not one decisive battle, but ongoing pressure. Indigenous groups returned again and again, sometimes in greater numbers. Even if the Norse won individual encounters, they could not change the long-term equation. They were a tiny outpost thousands of miles from their cultural core. Greenland itself was already marginal, a hard land, dependent on fragile trade with Norway and Iceland. Vinland was even further. Reinforcements were not waiting just over the horizon. If a ship was damaged, if supplies ran low, if too many fighters were injured, there would be no quick solution. This is the part that often gets overlooked in romantic Viking narratives. Exploration is exciting. Settlement is exhausting. You need stability, predictability, and relative peace. Vinland offered none of that. The Norse could not expand inland safely. Venturing too far from their camp meant vulnerability. Staying confined meant stagnation. Farming required time and calm seasons. But calm was never guaranteed. Meanwhile, the indigenous communities had every advantage of familiarity. They understood the migration patterns of animals, the terrain, the waterways. They could choose when and where to confront the settlers. They were not dependent on transatlantic supply chains. And there is something else. Morale. Living under constant threat erodes confidence. Every unfamiliar sound at night becomes a warning. Every trading attempt becomes a risk. Over time, even the boldest settlers begin to question the point. The sagas hint at this growing doubt. Leaders like Thorfinn Karlsefni are portrayed as ambitious but pragmatic. Karlsefni did not sail west simply for adventure. He sought profit and opportunity. But profit requires sustainability, and sustainability requires security. Vinland had resources. Timber, perhaps grapes, fertile land. But resources are meaningless if you cannot defend them long term. Eventually, the settlers faced a hard truth. They could survive another skirmish, maybe even several, but they could not win the future. And when you realize that the land itself resists your permanence, retreat stops feeling like failure. It starts feeling like strategy. By the time the Norse leaders began seriously considering departure, Vinland had already made its verdict clear. This was not a dramatic evacuation under burning skies. There is no saga scene of ships fleeing in chaos. Instead, the end feels quieter, almost reluctant. The settlers had come west, chasing opportunity. They had found fertile land, timber, and promise. But they had also found resistance. In the sagas, especially the saga of Eric the Red, the tone shifts from ambition to caution. Leaders like Thorfinn Karlsefni are portrayed not as defeated, but as realistic. They understood something critical. Expansion only works when the costs are lower than the rewards. In Vinland, the equation no longer made sense. Every clash with indigenous groups risked lives that could not easily be replaced. Every season brought uncertainty. The settlers were not conquering armies backed by kingdoms. They were families and traders operating at the very edge of their world. And then there was Greenland waiting behind them. Harsh, yes, but known. Familiar fjords, established farms, kinship networks. Even limited security feels comfortable when compared to constant threat. To stay in Vinland would have required escalation. More settlers, more ships, more sustained military defence. But organising that from Greenland, which was itself fragile, would have stretched Norse resources dangerously thin. The sagas do not describe a triumphant final battle that forced the Norse out. Instead, they describe a recognition. The land was too contested, the numbers too uneven, the hostility too persistent. In many ways, this is what makes the story so striking. The Norse were not defeated in one decisive moment. They were worn down by reality. It is tempting to imagine Vikings as unstoppable. But here, they confronted something more powerful than swords, demographic imbalance. The indigenous populations were not scattered bands easily brushed aside. They were established societies defending their territory. So the ships were prepared again. Supplies were gathered, livestock loaded, structures abandoned. Vinland, for all its promise, would not become another Iceland. And with that decision, the first known European attempt at settlement in mainland North America ended, not with annihilation, but with withdrawal. Sometimes history turns not on who fights harder, but on who decides the fight is no longer worth it. When the ships left Vinland, the story did not vanish. It changed form. Back in Greenland and Iceland, the experience of crossing the ocean and encountering new peoples became saga material. Over time, those oral accounts were written down in texts like the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. But by then, generations had passed. Memory had mixed with pride. And that matters. The sagas are not modern history books. They are stories shaped by identity. They preserve names like Leif Erikson and Thorfinn Karlsefni as bold explorers who pushed beyond the known world. They also preserve the term "scralings," framing indigenous peoples as strange and sometimes threatening. But whose perspective are we reading? The indigenous communities of North America did not leave written saga accounts of these encounters. Their histories were preserved orally, within traditions that do not survive in the same medieval manuscripts. That imbalance shapes how we understand this contact. We mostly hear the Norse voice. From that voice, the Norse are cautious traders, forced into conflict. They are brave but outnumbered. They withdraw strategically. It is a narrative of endurance rather than failure. Yet imagine the same events told from the other side. Foreign ships arrive. Outsiders build structures. They cut timber. They attempt settlement. Resistance follows. The strangers eventually leave. From that perspective, the outcome looks very different. The sagas also compress time. They present events in dramatic arcs: trade, tension, battle, retreat. But in reality, contact may have unfolded over several seasons, with pauses and uncertainties we can no longer reconstruct. What survives is not a complete record. It is a fragment. Archaeology, especially at Lanceau Meadows, confirms that Norse presence was real. Buildings stood there. Iron was worked there. This was no myth. But the emotional texture of those encounters, fear, curiosity, anger, is filtered through saga storytelling. Over time, the Vinland episode became almost legendary, a brief western crossing before Columbus. A forgotten chapter rediscovered centuries later, yet at its core it was something far simpler and more human. Two worlds met. They tried trade, they clashed. One withdrew. And in the retelling, that fragile encounter became myth, shaped as much by memory as by fact. When the Norse ships disappeared from the shores of Vinland, the encounter did not reshape the continent. There was no lasting colony, no fortified Viking cities, no permanent fusion of Norse and indigenous societies. Instead, there was silence. For nearly 5 centuries, no sustained European settlement would follow in mainland North America. The Norse withdrawal marked a quiet but profound turning point. It demonstrated something early and unmistakable. Crossing the ocean was possible. Holding land was another matter entirely. This was not a failure of seamanship. Norse sailors had mastered Atlantic navigation long before most of Europe imagined such voyages. It was not a failure of bravery either. The sagas make clear that men and women alike faced danger without retreating at the first sign of conflict. It was a lesson in limits. The Norse expansion across the North Atlantic had worked because the lands they settled, Iceland and Greenland, were sparsely populated. In Vinland, they encountered established indigenous communities who defended their territory. Geography had finally placed them in direct demographic competition, and they chose not to escalate. That decision may seem small in the grand arc of history, but it mattered. It meant that for centuries, North America remained shaped by indigenous civilizations without sustained European interference. The brief Norse presence left almost no cultural footprint beyond archaeology and saga memory. When later European expeditions arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, they did so largely unaware of the Vinland experiment. The knowledge had faded from mainstream European awareness. What had once been a bold frontier story had become a half-remembered tale on the edge of medieval literature. Yet today, sites like Lanceau Meadows remind us that this meeting was real. Iron nails, turf walls, and slag from metalworking tell a quiet truth. 2 worlds touched. Briefly, tense, fragile. The Norse called the people they met Scralings. The indigenous communities likely had their own names for the strangers who arrived in strange ships. Neither side fully understood the other, and that may be the lasting lesson of this encounter. Exploration is often celebrated as triumph, but sometimes the most important historical moments are the ones where expansion stops. Vinland was not conquered. It was tested and found unsustainable. In that quiet withdrawal, we see something rare in medieval expansion, a recognition that not every new world can be claimed. In the 17th century, along the wide and shifting waters of the Hudson River, the women of the Mohican villages carried the weight of survival on their shoulders. While European ships drifted up and down the river trading furs and claiming land, Mohican women knelt in dark soil, pressing seeds into the earth with steady hands. Their fields were not small garden patches. They were carefully managed agricultural spaces that fed entire communities. Corn rose tall in neat rows. Beans wound themselves upward along the corn stalks. Squash sprawled wide across the ground, protecting moisture and discouraging weeds. The three sisters were more than crops. They were a system, an inheritance of knowledge passed from mother to daughter. Agriculture was women's work, but that description understates its importance. Control of food meant control of stability. Mohican society depended on these harvests to sustain families through harsh winters and uncertain seasons. Without the fields, there was no village. Without the village, there was no tribe. Daily life followed a rhythm shaped by the land. Women rose early, worked communally, shared labour and knowledge. They understood the subtle changes in soil texture, the timing of rains, the warning signs of blight. This was not casual farming. It was environmental intelligence built over generations along the Hudson Valley. And yet, as steady as the seasons seemed, the world around them was beginning to shift. Dutch traders from New Netherland established posts nearby. Fur trade intensified. Strange goods entered Mohican communities: metal tools, cloth, firearms. Trade brought opportunity, but it also brought dependency. Through all of it, the women kept planting. They maintained the village structures, stored surplus harvests, and ensured that children were fed. Their labour rarely appeared in European records, but it formed the backbone of Mohican resilience. When disease swept through native communities, when alliances shifted, when conflict erupted between tribes or with colonists, it was the stored corn, dried beans, and preserved squash that kept people alive. These women were not warriors in the traditional sense. They did not stand in battle lines along the riverbanks, but their quiet strength sustained the tribe through war, epidemic, and encroachment. Long before treaties were signed or broken, the Mohican women of the Hudson Valley were already fighting, not with weapons but with seeds, soil, and endurance. The strength of Mohican women did not begin and end in the fields. It extended into the very structure of society. Among the Mohican of the Hudson Valley, lineage and inheritance followed the mother's line. Children belonged to their mother's clan. Identity flowed through women. This matrilineal structure shaped daily life in ways European observers rarely understood. While Dutch traders from New Netherland negotiated with male sachems and warriors, they often failed to grasp that political influence inside the village rested heavily with senior women. Longhouses were not simply shared homes. They were extended family centres, overseen by women who coordinated food distribution, resolved internal disputes, and protected clan continuity. When marriages occurred, men moved into the wife's household. It was her family network that anchored the union. Stability began with her. Elders among the women carried deep authority. They remembered alliances, rivalries, and kinship ties that stretched across the valley. In times of conflict, their counsel mattered. Decisions about relocation, diplomacy, or resistance were not made in isolation from them. As European encroachment intensified, this internal cohesion became critical. Land sales and treaties were foreign concepts imposed by outsiders. The Dutch and later the English viewed land as property to be bought and transferred. Mohican communities understood land as shared territory, interwoven with clan identity and survival. When colonial representatives sought signatures or agreements, they were engaging a system they only partially understood. Even if a male leader signed a treaty, the consequences fell directly upon the women who worked the land and sustained the families. They were the ones who felt the loss most immediately. Fields shrinking, hunting grounds contested, river access restricted. Disease further strained the fabric of society. Epidemics introduced through European contact swept through native communities in waves. Women not only farmed, but also cared for the sick, prepared the dead, and preserved what knowledge they could amid loss. Matrilineal memory became a fragile but powerful tool of survival. Despite mounting pressure, Mohican women maintained continuity. They taught children clan stories, agricultural techniques, and the meaning of belonging. They held together households even as population numbers declined. Their power was rarely visible to colonial records, but it was fundamental. Political authority in Mohican society was not only about public speech or warfare, it was about sustaining life. And in that quiet authority, women shaped the tribe's endurance far more than outsiders ever realized. As Dutch ships continued to move along the Hudson River, trade intensified, and with it came change. What began as cautious exchange between the Mohican and merchants from New Netherland slowly reshaped daily life in the valley. At first, trade seemed beneficial. Metal tools replaced stone ones. Iron axes made woodcutting easier. Copper kettles simplified cooking. Cloth provided new forms of dress. For Mohican women, some of these goods reduced physical labor. An iron hoe could turn soil more efficiently than traditional tools. But trade is never neutral. The fur market began to dominate regional relationships. European demand for beaver pelts grew rapidly, and native communities were drawn deeper into a system centered on export. Hunting patterns shifted. Men traveled further and more often. Time that might once have been spent reinforcing local food security increasingly fed distant markets. For Mohican women, this created subtle but significant pressure. As men prioritized fur trade, agricultural production became even more essential. If hunting territories were contested or overtrapped, it was the crops that prevented famine. If trade alliances fractured, stored corn still sustained families. Yet dependency crept in. Firearms entered the region. With them came a new kind of imbalance. Tribes that secured better access to Dutch weapons gained military advantages over rivals. Tensions escalated across the northeast. The valley became entangled in broader conflicts fueled by European trade interests. Women watched these shifts unfold within their own villages. They saw the benefits of iron tools, yes, but they also saw the risks of relying on imported goods. When trade routes were disrupted or alliances changed, those advantages could disappear overnight. Meanwhile, colonial settlements slowly expanded. What began as trading posts evolved into farms, fences, and permanent structures. Land once shared seasonally became surveyed and claimed. Women working the fields felt these changes most directly. Boundaries tightened, space narrowed, and through it all, they adapted. They incorporated new tools without abandoning traditional planting systems. They preserved seed knowledge. They maintained food storage techniques. Quietly, they balanced innovation with continuity. Trade promised prosperity. It also invited instability. For Mohican women of the Hudson Valley, survival meant understanding that every iron tool carried both convenience and consequence. And as European presence deepened, those consequences grew harder to ignore. Trade tension did not remain economic for long. By the mid-17th century, the Hudson Valley had become a corridor of competition, not just between native nations, but between European powers. The Mohican found themselves caught between Dutch ambitions from New Netherland and rival indigenous confederacies seeking dominance over the fur trade. One of the most destabilizing pressures came from the west. The powerful Mohawk, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, expanded aggressively during what historians now call the Beaver Wars. Access to Dutch firearms strengthened their campaigns. Raids intensified, territory shifted, alliances fractured. For Mohican women, war was not an abstract political matter. It meant villages relocating. It meant fields abandoned before harvest. It meant uncertainty about whether husbands, sons, or brothers would return from defensive expeditions. Agricultural cycles do not pause for conflict. Corn must still be planted in spring. Beans must still be tended in summer. Squash must still be harvested before frost. Women continued their labor, even as threats loomed beyond the tree line. Raids could strike suddenly. Smoke on the horizon was not always controlled burning. Sometimes it signaled attack. Villagers were occasionally forced to move closer to fortified areas or to seek protection near colonial settlements. Each relocation disrupted planting patterns and food storage systems. Disease compounded the damage. Epidemics weakened populations already strained by warfare. Women became caretakers in the most literal sense, nursing the sick, preserving traditions amid loss, and maintaining clan structure when elders passed away. In many cases, Mohican communities were pushed eastward or northward under pressure from Mohawk expansion. Some groups eventually migrated toward mission settlements in places like Stockbridge, reshaping their geographic and cultural landscape. Through all of it, Mohican women remained anchors of continuity. When political alliances shifted, they ensured that clan identity survived. When land was lost, they carried seeds to new soil. When warfare thinned the population, they raised the next generation with stories of who they were and where they came from. The Hudson Valley was no longer simply a homeland of steady river rhythms. It had become contested ground. Yet even in war, the strength of Mohican society did not rest solely in its warriors. It rested in the women who refused to let the village disappear, even when the valley itself was changing beyond recognition. War brought disruption. Disease brought devastation. As Dutch traders and later English settlers moved deeper into the Hudson Valley, they carried more than goods. They carried pathogens, smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses to which the Mohican had no prior exposure. What followed was not a single outbreak, but waves of epidemic that reshaped entire communities. For Mohican women, this crisis struck at the heart of village life. They were the primary caretakers. When sickness entered the longhouse, they tended the feverish, prepared herbal remedies, offered water, and remained beside the dying. There were no quarantines in the modern sense, no immunity built through previous exposure. The speed of transmission could feel terrifyingly sudden. Loss came quickly and repeatedly. Elders, the keepers of memory, were often among the most vulnerable. With them went stories, ritual knowledge, clan histories. Women did what they could to preserve what remained, teaching children songs and planting techniques even as funerals multiplied. Food production did not stop for grief. Fields still required tending. But epidemics reduced the labor force dramatically. Fewer hands meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant thinner winters. Women stretched stored corn and dried squash as far as possible. Preservation techniques became lifelines. European observers sometimes described native population decline in cold, numerical terms. But inside the villages, the impact was deeply personal. Mothers buried children. Sisters buried sisters. Entire family lines could shrink within a single season, yet survival continued. Mohican women adapted planting schedules to reduced populations. They consolidated households when numbers fell too low to maintain separate longhouses. They reorganized clan structures when matrilineal lines were broken. In some cases, communities drew closer to colonial settlements or Christian missions, seeking relative stability and access to new forms of support. This was not surrender. It was strategy, another way to endure in a landscape reshaped by invisible enemies. The quiet strength of Mohican women during this period cannot be overstated. They absorbed grief while continuing daily labor. They preserved identity while navigating cultural transformation. They rebuilt social fabric again and again. The Hudson River still flowed as it always had, but the world along its banks had changed. Disease had weakened the tribe more severely than any single battle. And yet, through fields replanted and children raised in the shadow of loss, Mohican women ensured that their people did not vanish. When English forces seized control of New Netherland in 1664, renaming it New York, the change was political on paper. But for the Mohican of the Hudson Valley, it meant another layer of uncertainty. The Dutch had already introduced trade dependency and territorial pressure. The English brought expansion on a different scale. Settlements multiplied. Fences appeared where shared land once stretched open. Deeds and surveys replaced seasonal movement. Land became something measured, divided, and sold. For Mohican women, This shift struck directly at their authority. They were the agricultural backbone of the tribe. They understood which fields had been used for generations, which soil held the strongest corn, which river bends offered the richest planting ground. But colonial land transactions rarely acknowledged that knowledge. Treaties were signed between male leaders and colonial officials, yet the consequences landed in the fields. When acreage shrank, it was women who adjusted planting patterns. When access to riverbanks narrowed, it was women who calculated how to feed the village from less land. English law introduced rigid property concepts unfamiliar to Mohican social structure: shared use, matrilineal inheritance, communal stewardship. These principles clashed with individual ownership enforced by colonial courts. Women who once moved freely across clan territory now found boundaries marked by fences and patrols. Pressure to convert to Christianity increased during this period as well. Missionaries believed they were offering salvation and stability. Some Mohican families relocated to mission communities, including settlements that would later be associated with Stockbridge. There, cultural blending intensified. Mohican women adapted yet again. Some learned new domestic skills introduced by missionaries while quietly preserving traditional agricultural knowledge. Some participated in church life while maintaining clan memory at home. They navigated two systems simultaneously. English rule also brought intensified conflict between colonial powers and native nations. Alliances shifted. Land was negotiated again and again, often to the tribe's disadvantage. Through each political turn, women recalculated how to preserve food security and family cohesion. Their strength was not loud. It did not appear in colonial records as speeches or military victories. It appeared in continuity, in children raised despite shrinking land, in harvests pulled from reduced fields, in traditions whispered into the next generation. The grip of colonization tightened, but Mohican women did not disappear within it. They endured, adjusted, and carried their people forward even as the valley transformed around them. As English settlement expanded and land along the Hudson River narrowed under deeds and fences, the Mohican faced a painful reality. Staying meant gradual disappearance. By the late 17th century and into the early 18th, many Mohican families began relocating eastward, eventually forming communities in places like Stockbridge. This movement was not a single dramatic exodus. It was a slow pulling away from ancestral ground, field by field, village by village. For Mohican women, migration was both physical and emotional labor. They carried more than household goods. They carried seeds saved from Hudson Valley soil. Corn varieties refined over generations were wrapped carefully and transported to new land. In those small bundles lay continuity. Leaving meant abandoning familiar riverbanks where children had learned to plant. It meant saying goodbye to burial grounds that held mothers and grandmothers. The land was not abstract territory. It was memory made visible, yet women approached relocation with practical resilience. Once new ground was selected, they evaluated soil texture, drainage, and seasonal patterns. They rebuilt planting systems. They adapted techniques to slightly different climates. Survival demanded flexibility. Mission communities introduced new structures: churches, schools, European-style houses. Mohican women navigated these institutions carefully. Some embraced aspects of Christianity while maintaining clan traditions in private spaces. Cultural identity became layered rather than erased. At the same time, disease and war continued to thin populations. The tribe that once held wide stretches of the Hudson Valley now clustered in smaller, more constrained settlements. Women bore the burden of maintaining identity amid compression. Children growing up in these relocated communities would hear stories of the river homeland. Mothers and grandmothers became living archives, describing planting seasons along the Hudson, the rhythm of village life before fences, the taste of corn grown in ancestral soil. Migration can fracture a people. It can also sharpen their sense of who they are. Through each move, Mohican women ensured that clan structure endured. They preserved matrilineal ties even as geography shifted. They taught daughters how to plant in unfamiliar earth, while reminding them where their people began. The Hudson Valley was no longer home in the same way. But in every seed replanted and every story retold, Mohican women carried that river within them. By the time Mohican families had resettled in places like Stockbridge, the world around them looked different from the villages once scattered along the Hudson River. Colonial towns were more structured. Churches stood at the centre of community life. English legal systems framed daily interaction. And yet, beneath these visible changes, the core of Mohican identity remained anchored in women. Matrilineal lines continued. Even within mission settings, clan belonging did not disappear overnight. Mothers still determined lineage. Grandmothers still shaped memory. The structure may have bent under colonial influence, but it did not fully break. Women carried cultural knowledge quietly. They wove traditional practices into daily life, in food preparation, in planting rituals, in the rhythm of storytelling after dusk. Children learned English prayers, perhaps, but they also learned ancestral names. This dual existence required intelligence and emotional strength. To survive, Mohican women often engaged with missionary expectations, attending church, adopting certain European domestic habits. But survival was not the same as surrender. Many preserved language fragments, agricultural customs, and kinship patterns inside the household sphere. Food remained central. Even when new crops and livestock entered the picture, the knowledge of corn, beans, and squash did not vanish. Women adapted planting techniques to new soil while maintaining the agricultural logic of the Three Sisters. Continuity could exist even within change. Meanwhile, political pressures continued. Land loss did not end with relocation. Colonial expansion pushed further inland. Mohican communities faced additional displacement in later generations. Through each stage, women recalculated how to preserve cohesion amid instability. Identity, in this era, was no longer tied exclusively to a single stretch of riverbank. It became portable. It travelled in memory, in recipes, in kinship language, in seeds carried from one settlement to another. The strength of Mohican women was not loud resistance. It was persistent presence. They refused to let assimilation erase everything. They chose carefully what to adapt and what to protect. In a world reshaped by colonization, war, and disease, Mohican women did something extraordinary. They made identity durable, even when the land beneath their feet kept changing. By the end of the 17th century, the Mohican presence in the Hudson Valley had been dramatically reduced. Land once cultivated by generations of Mohican women was now divided under colonial control. Villages had shifted eastward. Populations had been thinned by war and epidemic. And yet, disappearance never came. The story of Mohican women does not end in the Hudson Valley. It continues through migration, adaptation, and survival into the 18th century and beyond. Communities eventually moved further west, ultimately forming what is known today as the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. That survival is not accidental. It is the result of generational endurance. In the 17th century, Mohican women preserved what could have easily been lost. They maintained agricultural knowledge through displacement. They protected matrilineal identity when political systems shifted around them. They raised children in worlds that looked nothing like their grandparents' villages, yet taught them who they were. Their strength was rarely documented in colonial records. European writers focused on treaties, warfare, and male leaders. The daily labour of women, planting, storing, teaching, mourning, rebuilding, remained largely invisible to outsiders. But invisibility does not equal insignificance. Consider the chain of survival. A grandmother who remembers Hudson Valley soil teaches her daughter how to plant in new ground. That daughter teaches her own children the stories of the river homeland. Identity becomes layered, but it does not dissolve. The endurance of Mohican culture through centuries of pressure stands as quiet proof of that resilience. Colonial encroachment was relentless. Disease was devastating. Land loss was profound. But the tribe did not vanish. And behind that endurance were women who refused to let the fabric of their community unravel. They farmed through uncertainty. They migrated without surrendering memory. They balanced adaptation with preservation. They transformed grief into continuity. The 17th century tested the Mohican people severely. It altered geography and power structures along the Hudson. But it did not erase the strength rooted in clan mothers, farmers, and caretakers. When we look back at the Hudson Valley of that era, it is easy to focus on ships, traders, and colonial expansion. Yet beneath those visible shifts, Mohican women were doing something far more enduring. They were ensuring that their people would still exist, long after the riverbanks had changed hands. Long before the markets filled with shouting merchants and drifting smoke, the streets of Istanbul were claimed by bread. Ottoman street food culture did not wake up slowly. It announced itself at dawn with the rhythmic calls of simit sellers weaving through narrow alleys and across cobbled squares. Balanced on their heads or carried on wooden trays, rings of simit gleamed golden under the early light. Coated generously in sesame seeds, baked in stone ovens until crisp, they cracked slightly when broken apart, revealing a soft interior still warm from the heat. The smell alone, nutty, toasted, comforting, was enough to draw customers from doorways and shop fronts. Simit was affordable. That mattered. Dock workers along the Golden Horn, craftsmen opening their stalls near the Grand Bazaar, students heading toward madrasas, all could spare a few coins for breakfast. It was fast, portable, filling. No plates, no ceremony, just bread in the hand and the day ahead. Vendors developed regular routes. They knew which neighbourhoods stirred first, which workshops began early, which ferry crossings needed quick sustenance. Street food in the Ottoman world was not random chaos. It was organised rhythm. Dawn had its own economy. And simit was more than convenience. It was connection. In a city layered with languages, religions, and social classes, bread cut through difference. Muslims, Christians, Jews, all shared that morning ritual. For a brief moment, before politics and hierarchy resumed, the empire tasted the same crust. The sellers themselves were part of the spectacle. Their voices rose in melodic repetition, advertising freshness and warmth. Competition was friendly, but fierce. A stale simit meant lost customers the next morning. Quality built loyalty. Reputation travelled faster than any official decree. As the sun climbed higher, coffee sellers and dairy vendors began appearing. But the foundation had already been laid. Ottoman street cuisine started with something humble and elemental. The empire thrived on complexity. Trade routes, spices, silk, diplomacy. Yet each day began with bread sold in the open air. Before kebabs smoked in evening markets, and before syrup soaked into trays of baklava, there was the quiet crackle of sesame at sunrise. In that simple ring of simit, you can already glimpse what made Ottoman street food culture so powerful. Accessibility, aroma, and a city that never truly slept. If dawn belonged to bread, midday belonged to noise. As the sun climbed higher over Istanbul and other Ottoman cities like Bursa and Damascus, the streets thickened with movement. Porters shouted, donkeys pushed through crowds, merchants unfolded fabrics and spices beneath shaded arcades, and in the middle of it all, food vendors claimed their ground. This was when Ottoman street cuisine revealed its range. Large copper pots simmered gently over charcoal fires. Steam rose from lentil soups thick with cumin and mint. Rice pilaf, dotted with chickpeas or bits of lamb, waited in wide trays to be scooped into bowls for hurried customers. Street food at midday was practical. Workers had no time to return home for elaborate meals. Shopkeepers could not abandon their stalls. So the streets became dining rooms. A quick bowl of soup, a portion of pilaf wrapped in paper, a slice of flatbread folded around grilled meat. These sustained the city's momentum. Vendors often specialized. Some sold only stuffed grape leaves, carefully rolled and seasoned with herbs and lemon. Others offered burek, flaky pastries layered with cheese or minced meat, cut into squares and served hot. Their ovens were small but efficient, radiating warmth even in winter, Smell guided customers before sight did. Spices drifting through the air announced turmeric, black pepper, cinnamon. Ottoman cities sat at the crossroads of trade, and that global network flavoured the streets. Ingredients from Anatolia, the Balkans, Arabia, and beyond mingled in everyday dishes. There was hierarchy even in the marketplace. Certain vendors earned reputations for excellence. A particular corner might be known for the best lamb skewers. Another stall might be trusted for its perfectly balanced dolma. Word of mouth functioned as advertising long before printed signs became common. Yet, despite variety, street food remained accessible. It did not belong exclusively to elites dining in palace kitchens. It belonged to apprentices, sailors, scribes, soldiers, travellers. Midday in the Ottoman city was not quiet or refined. It was crowded, fragrant, and alive. And as copper lids lifted and ladles dipped into simmering pots, the empire fed itself in the open air. One bowl, one skewer, one folded pastry at a time. As the sun began to sink and the air cooled, Ottoman cities transformed again. If midday was steam and copper pots, evening belonged to fire. In neighbourhoods across Istanbul, glowing embers lit up narrow streets. Charcoal braziers were arranged carefully, metal skewers lined up in rows. And then came the sound, the gentle hiss of fat dripping onto hot coals. Kebab sellers dominated the twilight hours. Cubes of lamb, sometimes marinated with onion and spice, were threaded onto skewers and rotated slowly above the flames. The smoke carried a deep, savoury aroma that drifted through alleys and drew customers almost instinctively. This was not fine dining in a secluded courtyard. It was public theatre. You watched your meat cook. You heard it sizzle. You smelled the transformation. Street food in the Ottoman world was sensory and immediate. Flatbread warmed near the coals. Once the meat reached the right char, it was slid into bread with fresh herbs, perhaps a sprinkle of sumac or a squeeze of lemon. Simple, portable, satisfying. But kebabs were not the only stars of the evening. Sellers of kofta, spiced meatballs, shaped and grilled their mixture with practiced hands. Others prepared offal dishes, including liver skewers, prized for their richness. These foods were bold, unapologetic, and deeply rooted in regional traditions. The evening market also blurred social lines. Artisans finishing their workday stood beside travelling merchants. Soldiers on patrol grabbed quick meals before returning to barracks. Even wealthier residents sometimes ventured out for the atmosphere. Street food offered something restaurants could not: immediacy and authenticity. Lantern light flickered against stone walls. Conversations rose and fell. Musicians occasionally played nearby, adding rhythm to the hum of the crowd. The empire's diversity was visible in these moments. Languages overlapping, clothing styles varied, religions intersecting, all united by shared hunger. Smoke lingered long after the last skewers were sold. Ash settled. Vendors packed their tools. But for a few glowing hours each evening, Ottoman streets were transformed into open kitchens. Fire defined the scene, crackling, fragrant, communal. And in that rising smoke, you could taste the empire itself, layered, expansive, and alive long after sunset. If smoke defined the evening, sweetness followed close behind. Once the hunger for meat was satisfied, another aroma began drifting through Ottoman streets. Melted sugar, honey, and rosewater warming in copper pans. In cities like Istanbul and Aleppo, dessert was not confined to palace banquets. It belonged to the street. Vendors set up trays layered with syrup-soaked pastries, their surfaces glistening under lantern light. Baklava stood at the centre of this sweet culture. Thin sheets of dough brushed with butter, stacked and filled with crushed pistachios or walnuts, then baked and drenched in syrup. Cut into diamond shapes, it shimmered like edible jewels. Though associated with imperial kitchens, baklava also found its way into markets, offered in smaller, more affordable portions for everyday customers. Then there was lokum, what many now call Turkish delight. Soft cubes dusted in powdered sugar flavoured with rose, lemon or mastic. Some included nuts for texture. These were sold from wooden boxes or wide trays, often sampled before purchase. Children hovered eagerly, eyes fixed on the colourful squares. Sweet vendors had their own performance style. They sliced, lifted, and displayed their goods theatrically. Sugar became spectacle. Even the tools, large copper trays, long knives, carved wooden paddles, added visual drama to the sale. Dessert in the Ottoman street was not merely indulgence. It marked celebration. Religious holidays, weddings, circumcision feasts, all spilled into public spaces where sweets were shared generously. Offering a piece of baklava or lokum could signal hospitality and goodwill. There were also simpler sweets. Halva, dense and nutty, cut into thick portions. Fried dough soaked in syrup and sprinkled with crushed nuts. These were filling and affordable, accessible to labourers and merchants alike. Sugar itself carried global history. It travelled through vast trade networks that tied the empire to distant regions. Spices and nuts arrived along similar routes. In each bite, there was a quiet reminder of the Ottoman world's breadth. As night deepened, sweet vendors lingered. The glow of lanterns reflected off syrupy surfaces. Conversations softened, and in the final taste of honey and rosewater, the city closed its day not with smoke, but with sweetness. Proof that Ottoman street food culture satisfied not only hunger, but desire. No story of Ottoman street food culture is complete without coffee. By the 16th century, coffee had transformed urban life across the empire. In neighbourhoods of Istanbul and beyond, the scent of freshly roasted beans drifted through streets as surely as the smell of bread or grilled meat. Coffee sellers did not always operate from grand establishments. Many moved through markets with portable equipment. Small braziers, long-handled sesva pots, cups stacked carefully in trays. Water simmered gently. Finely ground coffee was stirred in, allowed to foam, then poured thick and dark into small cups. It was strong, bitter, intense, and it demanded attention. Street coffee was not simply a beverage, it was punctuation in the day. After a bowl of soup at midday or a skewer of kebab at dusk, men gathered around low stools or stood near vendors sipping slowly. Conversations unfolded about trade, politics, poetry, rumour. The empire's pulse could be felt in these exchanges. Coffee houses eventually became central gathering spaces, but even in open markets, coffee created temporary communities. A vendor might serve sailors from the Bosporus beside scholars from nearby madrasas. Social lines blurred, at least briefly, under the shared ritual of sipping. And coffee often paired with sweets. A cube of lokum alongside the cup softened the bitterness. The combination was deliberate, sugar and spice balancing roasted depth. Authorities sometimes worried about coffee's social power. Conversations held over cups could spark dissent as easily as friendship. Yet banning coffee proved nearly impossible. Its appeal was too strong. Street vendors ensured its constant presence. Women, though less visible in public coffee rituals, influenced the culture indirectly through preparation at home and participation in family celebrations where coffee marked hospitality. Even in private spaces, the beverage reinforced bonds. The preparation itself was theatrical. Watching foam rise in the small pot, hearing the gentle clink of cup against saucer, these details elevated the experience beyond mere refreshment. By the time night settled fully over the streets, coffee remained in steady demand. It kept merchants alert, storytellers animated, and gamblers awake. In the swirl of smoke, sugar, and spice that defined Ottoman street cuisine, coffee was the thread tying it together. It did not fill the stomach, it sharpened the mind, and in doing so, it made the street not just a place to eat, but a place to belong. To an outsider, Ottoman street food culture might have looked like delicious disorder, smoke drifting in every direction, vendors shouting over one another, copper pots clanging against stone. But beneath that apparent chaos lay structure. In cities like Istanbul, food vendors were often organized into guilds. These professional associations regulated quality, pricing, and conduct. A simit seller could not simply appear overnight and undercut everyone else. A kebab vendor was expected to meet standards. Reputation mattered, and guild oversight enforced it. The Ottoman state took food seriously. Bread shortages could trigger unrest. Spoiled meat could spark outrage. Authorities monitored weights and measures, inspected ovens, and sometimes fixed prices to prevent exploitation. Street cuisine was public and visible. That made it politically sensitive. Guilds also shaped training. Young apprentices learned under masters, absorbing recipes, techniques, and customer etiquette. How to season properly, how to manage charcoal heat, how to slice baklava evenly. Craftsmanship was inherited through mentorship. Uniformity mattered, but so did pride. Vendors decorated their carts carefully. Copper pots were polished to shine. Skewers were arranged neatly. Even the wooden trays of simit sellers carried a sense of identity. Presentation built trust. There were rules about where vendors could stand. Certain corners belonged to particular trades. Soup sellers clustered near workshop districts. Sweet vendors gravitated toward busy market squares. Coffee sellers positioned themselves strategically near social hubs. The city's geography shaped its flavor map. Disputes inevitably arose. Competition for customers was fierce, but guild mediation often prevented chaos from spiraling. The goal was balance, enough competition to keep quality high, but enough regulation to maintain stability. And stability meant reliability. Customers knew what to expect. A bowl of lentil soup tasted similar across neighborhoods because standards were shared. That consistency built confidence in street food as part of daily life. Even itinerant vendors followed informal codes. Cleanliness, though judged differently by modern standards, still mattered. A vendor with visibly poor hygiene would lose business quickly. Word traveled fast in crowded streets. So while smoke and spice filled the air, behind the scenes, there was organization. Ottoman street food was not random improvisation. It was structured tradition operating in open view. The result was something remarkable. A living, breathing culinary system sustained not just by appetite, but by order. Ottoman street food did not exist in isolation. It absorbed the empire's vast geography. From the docks of Istanbul to the caravan routes reaching Cairo and Damascus, ingredients traveled constantly. And when ingredients move, flavors follow. The empire stretched across continents. Spices from Arabia, nuts from Anatolia, citrus from the Mediterranean coast, coffee from Yemen, all converged in urban markets. Street vendors became the final link in a global chain of trade. Take spices. Cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, once rare luxuries in Europe, were woven naturally into Ottoman dishes. A simple pilaf might carry subtle warmth from imported seasonings. A sweet pastry might echo distant plantations. These were not random additions. They reflected commercial networks connecting ports and provinces. Pilgrimage routes also shaped cuisine. Travelers moving toward Mecca passed through major cities, bringing regional tastes with them. A vendor in Istanbul might adopt a technique seen in Damascus. A seller in Cairo might experiment with a spice popularized in Anatolia. Recipes evolved through exposure. Even migration within the empire influenced the street. Refugees from Balkan conflicts introduced variations of pastry and grilled meats. Merchants from Central Asia brought different bread traditions. Over time, the street became a culinary map of imperial diversity. The port districts especially embodied this exchange. Sailors returned with stories and preferences formed abroad. A craving picked up in Alexandria might inspire a new preparation method back home. Vendors who adapted quickly gained loyal customers eager for novelty. Yet despite this constant flow of influence, street food retained a recognizable core. Bread, meat, sweets, and coffee remained anchors. Innovation layered onto tradition rather than replacing it. What made Ottoman street cuisine so dynamic was its openness. It welcomed ingredients and techniques from afar without losing identity. The empire's political reach translated into culinary reach. In the clatter of markets and the glow of evening fires, you could taste connections stretching beyond city walls. A skewer might carry the scent of distant hills. A syrup might echo orchards hundreds of miles away. Ottoman street food culture was not just urban survival. It was edible geography, proof that an empire's roads and rivers ultimately led to the plate. For all its colour and aroma, Ottoman street food culture was not only about pleasure, it was also about survival. Cities like Istanbul were immense and constantly growing. Artisans, soldiers, labourers, migrants, not everyone had stable kitchens or reliable household supplies. For many urban residents, street vendors were not indulgence, they were necessity. Economic hardship visited the empire in cycles. Poor harvests, war expenses, inflation, and disruptions to trade could tighten food supplies quickly. When grain shipments were delayed or taxed heavily, bread prices rose. And when bread prices rose, tension followed. Street vendors acted as a buffer. Small portions made food accessible even during lean times. A single bowl of soup could stretch a coin further than raw ingredients purchased in bulk. Vendors adjusted portion sizes and recipes to reflect scarcity. Lentils might replace more expensive meats. Spices masked the absence of richness. The Ottoman state understood the danger of urban hunger. Bread riots were not theoretical risks, they were real possibilities. Authorities sometimes intervened directly to stabilize flour supply or regulate pricing. Yet enforcement alone could not solve everything. It was the constant presence of street food that softened the edge of crisis. Even during military campaigns, cities remained fed. Soldiers returning from the front sought quick nourishment. Vendors adapted, grilling faster, cooking in larger batches, keeping embers alive longer into the night. Women, though less visible as street vendors in many regions, influenced this lifeline culture within households. Families unable to cook consistently relied on prepared foods purchased daily. In poorer neighbourhoods especially, the line between home and street blurred. The street also offered flexibility. If income dropped temporarily, a worker could still afford a small portion. If employment improved, he might add sweets or coffee to the meal. The system scaled with circumstance. In times of hardship, luxury dishes faded, but soup, bread, and simple grilled meats endured. The essential structure of Ottoman street cuisine proved resilient. Behind the romance of smoke and spice lies this reality. The street kept cities functioning. It fed apprentices who could not return home at midday. It nourished widowers without kitchens. It sustained migrants far from family support. Pleasure and survival walked side by side. And in that dual purpose, Ottoman street food culture revealed its deepest strength, not only satisfying appetite, but protecting the fragile stability of urban life. By the time the Ottoman Empire began to fade in the 19th and early 20th centuries, its street food culture had already embedded itself deeply into urban identity. Empires shift, borders change, but habits of hunger are stubborn. Walk today through neighbourhoods of Istanbul, and you still encounter echoes of that earlier world. Simit sellers balance trays, much as their predecessors did centuries ago. Kebabs hiss over charcoal. Baklava glistens behind glass. Coffee foams in small cups. What makes this continuity remarkable is that it survived political upheaval, modernization, and industrialization. Street food adapted without disappearing. Gas replaced charcoal in some cases. Glass carts replaced wooden trays. But the essential structure, accessible, portable, communal, remained intact. The Ottoman street was never just about feeding the body. It shaped social rhythm. It determined where people gathered, how long they lingered, what they shared. Vendors were familiar faces in neighbourhoods. Recipes became markers of belonging. Even outside modern Turkey, traces remain. In the Balkans, in the Levant, in parts of North Africa, similar pastries, grilled meats and sweets continue to define daily life. These are not isolated coincidences. They are culinary descendants of an imperial network that once tied cities together through trade and migration. Street food endured because it was flexible. It could absorb new influences without losing identity. Tomatoes, once foreign to the old world, became common ingredients. New cooking techniques emerged. Yet sesame still crackled on simmet. Syrup still soaked into layered pastry. Coffee still demanded patience and conversation. There is something powerful about food that refuses to retreat indoors. It insists on being public. It fills the air with scent and draws strangers into shared space. Ottoman street cuisine mastered that openness. And perhaps that is its greatest legacy. Not a single recipe, not a single dish, but a way of feeding cities in plain sight. A culture of smoke rising at dusk, of sweetness offered after dark, of bread sold at dawn to whoever could spare a coin. Empires may crumble into textbooks, but in the narrow streets where sesame still clings to warm bread and charcoal still glows beneath skewers, the spirit of Ottoman street food lives on, vibrant, accessible, and unmistakably alive.